the primary purpose of this is to connect some dots between what we have talked about in the past regarding African immigration into Trinidad and East Indian immigration into Trinidad. I was putting together a presentation on this for us to look at sometime in September or October of this year. So because Dave cannot do his presentation this evening, I'm going to fill the slot with a couple of these tables. We could discuss them in greater detail later on. Yes? Okay, 1783. Last week, Roger de Pisa mentioned the Cédula de Populación, right? In which the Spanish were allowing white immigrants from other Caribbean countries to come to Trinidad and to bring their property with them. It was also around the time of the French Revolution and revolution in Haiti. And like De Pisa was saying, there were fires burning throughout the Caribbean. And he specifically talked last week about Grenada, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia having large numbers of French people who migrated to Trinidad when the fire got hot for them where they were. So in 1783, there were only 126 white people in Trinidad. They were all Spanish. In 1797, during the 14 years after, that number increased to more than 2,000, who were mostly French. You will also notice that coming with the whites were free colored people. So when you look at this, right, if you look at 3 and 1, 4, you have about 420 people who were either white or free coloreds on the island in 1783. You have more than 6,500 in 1787. But that wasn't the biggest change. The biggest change was that these people brought slaves with them. And now you had about less than 200 Spanish white people governing an island on which there were 10 times as many French white people and free coloreds, right? And the Spanish people no longer had the majority of the slaves who were on the island. Now, these slaves during this 14-year period were forced to work on plantations and the plantation agriculture system. They were the mainstay of that system. So the population changed dramatically. That is the point, right? Between 83 and 97. Notice that the Amerindians who were there were decreasing. Okay, now what's significant about 1797 is that this is the year that the governor of Trinidad became British, right? This was the year when a treaty was signed among the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the British, and Trinidad became a British colony, right? And as you know, we stayed British till 1962. So keep your eye on these numbers. I'm going to show you the next set of numbers, right? Remember, 100.
Just a minute, please.
Yeah.
For a point of clarification.
Yes.
Are you suggesting that we became British as a consequence of a treaty, or because Abercrombie sailed into Trinidad and captured the place?
Okay, so Larry, that is food for a lot of conversation. I will argue that Don Jose Maria Chacon was fed up of the French people who he had to govern, and he set things up to welcome the British troops into Trinidad and didn't put up any resistance because he was very happy to hand over the government to somebody else because he was fed up trying to get support from Spain and didn't. So,
No,
so,
but it was not
so
part of a treaty.
okay, so the treaty, I think it was the Treaty of Versailles came soon after, yes? And so there wasn't any back and forth then between the Spanish trying to get back Trinidad or the French trying to take it over. Trinidad remained a British colony, and that is the only point that I'm making from 1797 up to 1962. So the only point that I'm making is that up to 1783, from the time Trinidad was landed on by Columbus and his crew in 1498, up to 1783, Trinidad was under Spanish rule and populated by Spanish whites and their housekeepers and so on. Between 1783 and 1797, the French were allowed to come in, and from 1797 and beyond, we were under British rule. That's all that I am saying.
So Dennis, last week we learned that the Spanish weren't interested in sugarcane and stuff. They were after gold, and hence the development or the population of Trinidad was subdued to begin with, right? So the British come along, and they now want sugarcane and sugar, right? So the other
Okay.
islands who were
Yeah.
under
So
British control prior to Trinidad,
mhm.
were they already into sugarcane production, sugarcane plantation, and sugar production? And if so, do you know how long before?
Okay. So Barbados was producing sugar 200 years before Trinidad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and if I might interject,
Yeah, yeah.
Haiti was the jewel in the French crown. Okay, Haiti was producing more sugar than all the British and Spanish islands combined. Okay, when the Haitian Revolution happened around this time. You see what I'm saying? So um, you could imagine the tremendous impact on the French economy the loss of Haiti alone would have had,
Yeah,
right?
and DP, Haiti is so much larger than all of the other islands like Barbados and Jamaica and so on combined. You could see that in terms of landmass. But I think that Hispaniola, yes,
Mhm.
was so well developed in those days that I think that was the largest producer of sugar in the world at the time. Not true, Roger?
Yeah, but remember that Hispaniola was also Spanish and French. Haiti on one side, and what is now the DR on the other side. Okay, the culture was different because whereas sugar production was pretty much all that there was in Haiti, okay, in what we now know as the DR, it was more, should I say, pastoral with cows and horses, right? So that Spanish and the Spanish influence was heavy there as well. So what people don't know, okay, is that after you know, there's a yin and they knocked off these people in France. They also liberated Hispaniola, well, the DR part of it, okay? All right. And later on, the people in that area overthrew the Haitians, okay, and recalled the Spanish people, you see.
Okay, so now what I think that this presentation tonight will do is that it will allow us to see that in order to understand Trinidad, we have to understand the history of what was happening in other parts of the world. And we could start with places like the English-speaking Caribbean, right? So when we think of Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, St. Lucia, if we understand a little bit of what was happening in these places, it will help us to put Trinidad in context and perspective, where we see that the slave experience was different, right? And so Trinidadians have to realize how fortunate we were as a people to not have hundreds of years of that slave experience, but rather decades. And so the only thing that I want to show here on this slide is that under British rule, right, from 1797 to 1806, the number of slaves doubled.
Yeah. If you guys would allow me to be a little more specific, I'm reading here out of this book, but I can't show it now. It's called The Slave Masters of Trinidad. And I'll just read a couple of lines, okay, if you guys don't mind. This is chapter 1, the emergence of Burnley. All right, so in 1796, after Spain declared war against England, Sir Ralph Abercrombie was instructed by His Majesty's government to sail to the West Indies to capture Trinidad and Puerto Rico that were in Spanish hands.
Yeah.
Okay, so it goes on and so on, right? He says that the British naval forces were composed of the Spanish naval forces were composed of 4 ships of war, 1 frigate, 91 commissioned officers, 581 Marines, and 1,032 seamen. The British forces, on the other hand, under Abercrombie, had 9 ships of war, 3 frigates, 5 corvettes, and 6,750 soldiers. Okay, the Spanish troops had only a poorly fortified garrison with no buildings sturdy enough to withstand the might of the British. Okay, so it goes on, next paragraph, he says here, Abercrombie ships approached the island and formed a semicircle around Chaguaramas Bay to prevent the Spanish commandant named Apadoca from escaping. Okay, Chacon tried to rally his troops without success. The 200 men he ordered to Chaguaramas to act as reinforcement disappeared into the woods. Okay, they never reached Chaguaramas. Okay, so Admiral Apadoca reported to Governor Chacon that his forces were overwhelmed. The forts were without water and he was unable to defend the bay. Escape was not an option. Therefore, he assembled a council of war. They unanimously agreed that the ship should be burnt at their anchorage rather than fall into the hands of the invaders. Okay, and just one quick paragraph, and I think I'll stop there. As the ships burnt, the fire quickly reached the magazine, causing an explosion heard throughout the night. Okay, realizing that the enemy had been reduced to ineffectiveness, Abercrombie and his men disembarked and headed for Port of Spain. Okay, Chacon retreated to St. Joseph, the old capital of the island, where he prepared to make his next move. At 8 o'clock that evening, Abercrombie sent an officer to St. Joseph with a flag of truce, offering him an honorable capitulation. He welcomed it. The next morning, February 18th, the terms of the capitulation were agreed upon. The Spanish laid their arms down and the war was over. Okay, that evening a treaty was signed at the home of Don Jose Mayan, okay, on a Valsayn estate, and Trinidad formally became a member of the British Empire. So that is what happened.
Thank you. Larry,
Okay.
you have any questions or comments to connect with what DP just read?
Nope.
just one addition. I
Yes.
would like to say
Yes, right.
that was also said, in fact, the letter that was sent to from Abercrombie to Chacon is in the book, The History of the Western Islands of Trinidad and Tobago. And all the dates clarify what Roger has just said. And the signing of the Article of Capitulation at Valsay.
Okay.
The fall of Trinidad was a bitter blow to the King of Spain, who at once set up a council of war under the governor of Cadiz to inquire into the behavior of Chacon and Apodaca. And it goes on to tell you the punishment they faced. And Chacon ended up in exile and all that. Okay.
Okay.
This is by Gertrude Carmichael, History of Trinidad, the Islands of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, and Radford, because Larry had a special interest in that, if you have a paragraph or two that you want to read, I will wrap up here in about 5 minutes and you could read us a little segment, yes?
Okay.
All right, so guys, what is the point that I was trying to make here? 1807 was also the year of the official end of the British slave trade. So really, the British were only the governing power in Trinidad for 10 years before the official slave trade was abolished. So that's what I'm saying, is that the impact of the British colonial slave masters on the population of Trinidad was for a much shorter duration than it was in other places. And I want to expand upon that at some point in time in the future, but it's something that I did not know. Right, and so all of us are reading, this year that we've come together, we've been reading about different things. None of us in this group were history majors. We all learning as we go along and reading to fill in gaps, right? And so what I wanted to try and help you all fill in and see is that the number of slaves went up to 20,000. But by the time slavery was abolished, that was the number of slaves that were there, right? It wasn't as though it was hundreds of thousands of slaves. Now, the experience of Brazil is very different from the experience of Trinidad, but there might be parts of Brazil where the experience was more similar, right? And so, the guys here have talked about Bahia having a special connection. And so, Deepisa and others had talked about that before. Roger, if you want to share anything more on that connection, I will hand over to you now. But I've made my point, which was, hey, the British were only here from 1797 to 1807 before the slave trade was officially abolished.
Okay, somewhere else in my reading, I found the fact that prior to the Haitian Revolution, something like 20 years or so, before, the population of Haiti, the enslaved African population of Haiti, either doubled or tripled, okay? Because I guess sugar production was really being ramped up.
At an all-time high.
Okay, so the point is that basically a lot of African-born enslaved people lived in Haiti, okay, and were brought to Trinidad during the revolution. All right, so what it is you have happening is a lot of people coming with their experiences and knowledge from the continent, okay, and and building on that, which is similar to what was going on, because it's the same people, right? Most of them who went across to Brazil. You see, and that's why you kind of have the commonality between the Bahias and the Trinidad. Okay.
Roger, during that time, a large number of people headed south to Trinidad, but a large number also headed north to the United
To
States.
It's, yeah.
New
Are they the
Orleans and so
people
on.
who ended up in Louisiana and environs?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So
At
that
least some
might
of them.
explain some of the cuisine then, right?
Yes,
Some of the
yes,
meat.
because in addition to that, right? Remember, you also had the seasoning process going on, which is something we had talked about before.
Yes.
Okay, and a lot of American slavers would have taken advantage of the seasoning process because there they could get people who had really been seasoned, acclimatized to the whole slave condition. Okay, and the trip from the US to the Caribbean was much shorter than the trip from the US to the African coast. And that too could explain why it is the prices of an enslaved person might have been higher in the US than it say was in the Caribbean or South America. Okay.
Because the trip was longer, you're saying?
The trip was longer, plus you're getting people who were already acclimatized
Okay.
to the conditions of the plantation.
They had some experience with the conditions and the job.
Yeah, because remember, it was different climate, different food, different working conditions, okay, that they had to endure, right?
Yes. So, guys, I want to throw one more piece of information into the mix that makes Trinidad a really special place. Right? You all will remember that some time ago we also talked about the War of 1812 in the United States, where we had free blacks fighting on the side of the British Crown against the American colonists who were there and losing that war of 1812, and Britain relocating those troops to Trinidad. And they became the Americans, right? They became first company, second company, up to sixth company that are in that Princeton region, right? From New Grant to Moruga, yes? And so in that region, where I grew up, close to where Michael Redhead grew up, were people who were free blacks living in Trinidad, right? Before slavery was abolished. And so when they brought these free black men from America to Trinidad, they tried to put them down south away from where the enslaved blacks were working to kind of get some kind of geographical separation. But we know we have a classmate who is a descendant of the Americans. Pelham Huggins is a descendant of the Americans. And one of Pelham uncles wrote a book about it. And so one of these days, I want for us to talk specifically about the Americans and what they have contributed to Trinidad. Yes, so let's put that
Actually,
on the list of things.
I have a video as well. I think that was done by the Parliament channel of Trinidad and Tobago on
Okay.
the Americans. Okay, but
Yeah.
they were they also adopted a sort of military style approach to their development. Okay, everything was sort of regimented. Hence, the first company and the second company. So people were put into the various regiments that they had, formed themselves in. Okay, so that they could develop different areas. Okay,
Dennis,
along those lines.
Yeah.
Dennis, I was surprised. I didn't know that of the short duration of the slave trade in Trinidad relative to the other Caribbean islands. And in my mind, it raises the questions of how how did that short duration of a decade or so compared to 2 centuries, you say like in Barbados, how did that manifest itself in Trinidad's culture? How would it differ? What differences, I don't know, but I'm saying what differences did we see coming, between us and other countries? And maybe this is a topic you may cover when you do your formal presentation.
Well, okay, so here's what I want to say. The question is a very important question. I don't know the answer to the question. I think that we might need to involve somebody like Larry, for example, who's lived in Barbados and whose wife was born there, to probably educate us a little bit more about the history of Barbados and how people from Barbados are similar or different from people from Trinidad, right? We might want to get people from some of the other islands to come and say to us, hey, all your Trinis does behave different from we, and here's what we think, right? And so we could go many ways with this, but my direct answer to your question is I don't know, right?
Yeah.
But I would like to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of things. If Larry wants to say something, I guess he can interject at this point. If not, then I will continue.
Larry?
You're on mute.
Are
So
Black women in Barbados different from Black women in Trinidad?
Women specifically or people?
Yeah. Are they much more beautiful and tolerant of guys like yourself?
Well, the thing is, remember, I mean, going to Barbados, you're a novelty. So
Still in 2021?
when I started going there in the early 70s, so I remember we were going to visit a friend, and these two little children playing outside. One run, he said, hey, come and see an Indian.
Hey, look at Mas.
What he asked. But then I realized that they are much Indian. I was staying up in the north of the island, up in St. Peter, just a little village called a mile and a quarter, and it's a mile and a quarter north of Speightstown. And I was the only Indian for miles.
Now, Larry, would Grace say that people of African origins from Trinidad behave very differently from people of African origins from Barbados? Oh, and just for
absolutely,
I think benefit, Larry studied in Barbados and got married to a Barbadian girl.
The work ethic is completely different. Plus, the way they live their lives too, they're very friendly and welcoming. Trinidadians tend to be suspicious. And it all depends too on where you are on the island, right? Like there's a huge difference because of that fault line that Curtis pointed out to us, where the north of the island is really the Caribbean and the south of the island is South America. And it shows with the behaviors. So even the Jamaicans are completely different. And I think it goes back to the point you were making earlier, Dennis, where Trinidad's slavery experience was very short, while Jamaica, Barbados was centuries. So them wanting to move forward and unburden themselves of the yoke of slavery is a huge driving point for them. Also, the huge sense of community that you feel within the groups and helping each other and helping others which really isn't there to a large part in Trinidad, is present in those communities.
Well, I would want to disagree with you a little bit. Um, from the point of view of this, I don't think I have never heard any other Caribbean person speaking Bajan. I've heard Trinidadians speak Jamaican, and there's a particular reason for that, you see, because people have generally viewed Bajans to be very conservative, to be very English, you
But
see.
that is true, Roger, because remember, they were never, they were always a British colony.
Mm,
Always. So all the traits that they had within Barbados are always going to be significant British traits. I went with my wife to get a driver's license, right? And
mm.
this gentleman there, and he said, Madam, this is about the fifth time I've been here, and I've been sent around to many different people. And right now I am very, very angry. I am extremely angry about being given this runaround and the situation I'm being placed in. And I need to get my issue resolved at the earliest convenience. Now imagine that were Trinidadian.
Yeah, but be that as it may, and Rajatai, made reference to last seeing me going up an elevator on the third floor of that UV math building, natural science building. There was also a white guy, one of the few white folks who were with us on campus. Okay. Um, this guy left and went to Barbados, like the year he graduated or something. I recall seeing him one time after that. And this guy was talking pure Bajan. You know what I'm saying? I couldn't tell the difference between a Trinidad accent and the guy was just talking around a Barbadian accent. I have never in my life heard anybody
Roger,
talk Bajan.
Roger,
Let me finish.
when I lived there, I used to speak rank Bajan too,
No, but the
and I
point
could
I'm making,
still do it.
very good for you. The point I'm making is
So,
that, I think it's a class thing,
I don't
right?
think so, I would beg to disagree. I have family who lived in the US, and the
Uh-huh.
only way people understand you is if you talk like them. As you repeat everything you say as a Trinidadian, you talk too fast. What language are you speaking?
Yeah, you slow down your enunciation and your diction and whatever, but you don't adopt a different accent. I don't think I have a Canadian accent,
you
and I've
do.
been here like I have slowed down the speed
Roger,
at
you
which I
do.
have I
You do, and
speak.
you have Canadian inflections. You may
What
not
do you mean,
see it in
Canadian?
yourself, but you do.
All right,
It's
take your word for it.
yeah, it's interesting, the conversation, because as a Trinidadian teaching in Canada, I cannot use the Trinidad dialect. It ain't happening, it ain't, and this sort of thing. So you think very carefully about what you have to say and how you enunciate it. But when I go back to Trinidad, I will
Refreshing.
I will fall into it. But yet people say to me, "You're not a Trini, are you?" Because what has happened over the 50 years I've been here is that my speech and intonation has changed, my values have changed, and so on. So my daughter asked me the question 2 years ago, Dad, when somebody asks you, what are you? Are you a Trinidadian? Are you a Canadian? it was a difficult question to answer. Even though I spent my first 25 years in Trinidad, I have spent most of my life in Canada. My response to her at that time, and I'm still thinking about it, is that I'm a hybrid Trini, if there's such a thing. Because there are things that I would put up here with that I cannot put up with in Trinidad, especially things like time and so on. I remember that my wife had a session with a lawyer. He promised that the appointment was set for 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock. She got there before 10 because she's one person who's prompt. And here, if somebody tells you you have an appointment for 10 o'clock, you go for 10, right? 11 o'clock came, no lawyer. She asked the secretary, where's the lawyer? Oh, he's coming. 12 o'clock came, no lawyer. Still same response. 1 o'clock, the guy walked in. And when she confronted him, his response was, but woman, here, say I here. And that's the type of thing you get in Trinidad that you never get here. So that's what I mean in terms of values changing and other accents will change, will be modified because of the different situations you're in. As a teacher here, I am teaching a diverse group of students. And I cannot use my Trini accent, Trini talk as such.
Yeah, and the thing is too, and I'm sure some of you guys may have experienced this. You know, teaching in Toronto specifically, most of the people I teach are from the Indian continent. And some of the intonations and so on that these students use, totally different from Canadians and Trinis. For example, you know, I was telling, and I was reported for this, I don't know why, you know, but you know, I was telling students, you know, it's very confusing when they do this. You know, they shake their head up and down, and they really mean no. You know, right? Like how Dennis is shaking his head there. He means that he doesn't understand, you know, doesn't he? And to me, that is confusing because that is the opposite of what I know. I mean, this is yes and this is no, right? But if they want to acknowledge something as yes, they do this, you know.
And in fact,
so somebody said that was racist. I don't understand why, you know. But.
And those are some of the things we discussed at a staff meeting at one of my schools.
Yeah, but Raja,
acknowledge differences with other people.
Even if it wasn't racist, it was not culturally appropriate for you to address it so, right? So let me leave that alone.
Anyway, come back to the original discussion.
No,
which is,
maybe
I wanted to make one point.
Recording whenever you're ready, right? So
yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I just wanted to make one point about the different people that were in Trinidad. Okay. And to link this back to last week's presentation about Calypso and the French
Roger,
influence.
before you make that point, let me interrupt you. Anybody else want to say anything?
No.
So I would like to say something. But I'm giving Roger the piece of the floor.
No, you go ahead. Because if you do that, you would never get this one.
Yeah. And
don't worry, Roger. I'll be brief. Okay, and then you can make your point.
Only one Roger could talk in these things.
Okay, Roger, I will go after you. If you want to talk, I'll go after you. But anyways, given the amount of people when the carnival started, okay. Remember, this is before the emancipation. Okay, Trinidad was still a slave society, so the slaves themselves couldn't really frolic about the streets. They had to stay on the plantation. But the free people who came from these islands, okay, could have gone on the streets. You see, they didn't have any big house or big plantation like these white folks to revel on. Okay, so that when emancipation came in 1835, Well, you had the 4 years indentured servant thing happening. Okay, so in 1839, when the slaves got that was the first opportunity they really had to go onto the streets. You see,
Yes.
right? And the attitude they displayed, like what this white author refers to as barbarism and so on, right? Is that we want to just get on bad, you understand? Because all of this stuff that we went through for the last how many ever years, right? Men just got an opportunity to fling that in all your face. You understand? Which is why the woman and you wind down in the road and somewhat, some of them naked as well or semi-naked and so on. You throw all of that stuff back in your face. So there is that.
Yes, Judge.
There's a point about what you were saying there, right? But in the figures that Dennis put up, you notice that there were a lot of French influence, right? And the wind down in the road half naked is only something that occurred in the last maybe 50 years.
No.
More.
No. Last week I read something from Carnival of 1847, and it was pretty much the same behavior with the jab and the women who were described as almost naked or semi-naked and so on.
Right, but you notice that in India there's the juve and the stuff like that, which to me suggests that there's a lot of French influence.
Oh yes.
Right.
Oh yes.
And I remember my grandmother, which was basically she was a postmaster in Sandy Grande and stuff. And she was telling me that when people went to what was considered the carnival
Parade.
preamble to carnival.
Oh, preamble.
There was a preamble to carnival.
Yes.
They were addressed appropriately. It was more, yes, we know that this is coming, and you were addressed appropriately. And basically, the only time you let your hair down was basically on the carnival weekend. But there was a preamble, and you didn't have this because the British had this thing about if you was lewd, you could have been arrested.
Right.
Yeah. There's a long history about that.
So you didn't have that behavior per se.
But the behavior was on the carnival Monday and Tuesday. Okay.
Yes.
Right. And previously to that, it was 3 days: Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. But the thing about it, PK, is that you had a tension between the English and the French, or more specifically, the Catholic people, who were the French and the Spanish, and the non-Catholic people, who were the Anglican British, basically, you see. And one set of people who felt that the Sabbath was like a very holy day, and so you have a lot of literature, a lot of articles in the newspaper, a lot of court documents about men, what do you call that? Partying on the Sabbath, desecrating the Sabbath, right? And that was primarily coming from the British, right? Because that was not the experience in the French islands. So there is that, you see.
All right.
Okay, so I'll shut up now, Mr. Watertongue, Health Department.
Yeah, well, there's also that behavior among the British also comes with their social repression. So they brought that with them because you still had that distinction in classes where you had, if you look back in England, you still had that behavior between the working class. But when you look at the people who actually came, who were the well off, their approach to life was different, and that was mimicked.
All right. So, guys, let me just try to summarize what I tried to do today, right? With Dave Grohu unable to present himself.
Can I say something?
Yeah, Wayne.
Yeah, I just want to make a little comment about the Americans who came to Trinidad, and something I found out that was very interesting watching my cooking shows, that there's a particular type of rice that was found only in Moruga, and that chefs in Carolina had to go back to Trinidad to get that particular kind of rice because it was brought by the Americans.
From the Carolinas.
Yeah. So
Well,
it makes us.
I'd like to add to that. So Moruga Hill rice is now being grown and marketed. And the brains behind the company is a press man.
Well, indeed, that Moruga rice is something that came from Africa, and it was
Mhm.
actually platted into the hair of some of these women who came across on the Atlantic journey. Okay, which
That's
is
an
an
interesting fact.
fact. Yeah.
Larry,
But-
who is the press man?
He was years after us. He was probably in press when you were teaching.
Marshall Montano time?
Yeah, because he was in a class with Larry Mohammed.
Okay, okay.
Because
And
Larry was telling me he's looking to get into marketing Moruga Hill rice here.
wow. And DP, tell us where that rice would have come from now. Which coast, which countries eat
Well,
rice?
I
Yeah.
think it was from somewhere in West Africa, probably Nigeria.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking either Yoruba or Igbo or one of these
And
nations.
DP, what
Mhm.
what was it? Let me say how to put this. Did they do this deliberately? Put this
Yes,
rice in
they
the
did. They
hair
did.
and
Actually, they did. Because
and
remember, the food was different, right? So that when
Mhm.
these people were captured, or prior to them being captured, they would do the braids, okay, and plait these rice grains into their hair.
so,
Yeah,
so
so mother, that sounds like it would be a survival strategy that would not have
Yeah.
developed in the first 5 or 10 years. But when people know what was going on and what they was going to face, that allowed them to at least carry some of their food that they could have planted and survive with.
Yeah.
So
And
it's
remember,
not so much survival on the journey because you wouldn't have anything to cook it in, I guess, other than
Yeah.
what
This is
they
the
people give
plant
you.
to make
But-
food, yes.
yeah,
But when you reach, interesting.
yeah, and remember too, kidnapping and warring between
Tribes.
nations on the African continent was something that happened for a hell of a long time. Okay, so the Dahomey women and so on would, form raiding parties. People would initiate warfare against their neighbors, specifically so that when they capture these people, they could sell them to other traders who would eventually sell them to the Europeans. Right? So it was a money-making business up and down the chain.
I have,
Right?
I have a question. Since you all seem to have been, I would say, more versed in the topic than me, but I came across an interview with a historian that suggests that there's a major difference between the Jamaican blacks and the Trinidadian blacks. And it had to do with the aggressive levels. Anybody ever heard about that? Or what the person went on to state was Jamaica is where the prime slaves fetch the highest cost, the highest value. And the traders, what you couldn't sell in Jamaica, they would sell to other islands.
I don't think that is true, at least that last statement. Okay.
Right?
Specifically because plantation owners, okay, sought different people out specifically, okay. So, you know, I know a boat is coming in and I own a plantation. All right. So I'm not going to take one set of people. I'm going to take some Igbo. I'm going to take some crew. I'm going to take some Hausa. Okay. And there's a specific reason for that, which is that when these people arrive on the plantation, okay, the Yoruba people will go with the Yorubas, the Hausa people will go to the Hausas, and so on, because clearly they could speak the same language. All right. And, you know, if the Yoruba people plotting against the plantation owners, guess what the other people doing? We're not involved in that.
Telling the
Understand?
plantation.
Exactly. Right. So it
Well,
was a way of quelling rebellion.
the reason why I think it came up in what I don't know what the science is behind it, because there's a study around that, right?
Mhm.
In that the Jamaicans themselves, or the black Jamaicans, or the slaves Jamaicans, or the descendants, were very aggressive in behavior compared to, say, Trinidadians. Now, it could have been that they were choosing different tribes, but they were basically enslaved for work. So you tend to find maybe the fittest would be fetching the higher prices of the islands. In some of the islands, right? And you would tend to find that their argument was that some of the other colonies got, I would use the word lesser quality slaves, if you wanted to put it that
No,
way.
I disagree.
Okay.
Specifically because, and I know I don't want to take too much time. The culture was different. Okay, so you know, British and Jamaica were very harsh. Okay, and they had things like um blockbusting and so on. I don't know if you know about that, right? You know, the Spanish were more accommodating than the Dutch in Guyana. Okay, because if you look at myself and yourself and Radford and so on, okay, and look at the typical Guyanese, you would see that the Guyanese people are more closer in tone, skin tone, to the Africans that came. And the reason for that is that, you know, the Spanish allowed the commingling of people, whereas the Dutch did not. Okay, and in Jamaica, the treatment of people was very, very different than what happened elsewhere in Trinidad and elsewhere, because most of you people were domestic servants, as you pointed out, for those 300 years, or how many ever of Spanish rule, you know.
Piggybacking what Roger is saying, we inherit physical traits from our parents, but there are social traits that we inherit from the society. So whatever obtained in Jamaica, social circumstance, would have been transmitted down generation to generation to generation. So if you had a harsh environment back 300 years, every subsequent generation after that, that would have been in your social DNA. So it's not surprising that people in different islands could have the same skin color, but behave differently, have different outlooks. It all comes down to social inheritance. That's piggybacking on what Roger De Pisa is saying, not Roger Atai.
Okay. So, thank you, PK. Now, guys, clearly we don't know enough. We don't have enough information to answer some of the questions raised. And so, Roger Atai, I want to also suggest a different reason why the Jamaicans are as aggressive as they are, based on different logic. If the ship was coming from Africa, it would have passed by Trinidad and other islands before it get to Jamaica.
No, beg to differ. The best slaves are the ones that are alive, and the strongest slaves fetch the most money.
Hold on. If you came to Trinidad first and the people here picked the slaves, what reached to Jamaica are the slaves who were left.
Well, I thought it was the other, well, they said it was the other way around.
Right. So that means that we had to do some research.
Right? Basically, it was like twice a slave in Trinidad was half the price purchased than a slave in something like Jamaica. It was that valuable a commodity. So they take the best, the healthiest, the strongest.
Okay. And
Larry
so,
has a point.
yeah,
Huh?
so that needs to be researched, and we'll come back and talk about it with real information, not with I think so, right? Which is what I am doing right now.
I'm going back to a point Dennis had made earlier with the slave experience in Trinidad, where that period of slavery was extremely short. While you look at Barbados and Jamaica, it was extremely long. The conditions in Jamaica may have been extremely harsh. When you look back at the slave rebellions, right? Jamaica had many of them. You had people escaping the plantations, going up into the hills and forming their own communes. That's where you had the Maroons living up in the hills. So their experience with slavery was completely different to a short-lived experience in Trinidad.
So Larry,
Let me just say this
hold on.
as a point of
Larry,
clarity.
Yeah, Larry, connect that with what PK was saying. And
So
that says that the social history
exactly
was different, that was passed down in each of the islands, right? So yes, Roger.
One more point. When I went to Barbados in 1974 and I was studying there, do you know that people were still working on plantations? Still working on plantations. They still had active plantations, plantation houses there.
Didn't know that.
Interesting. Yeah, the point I want to clarify is that don't make the mistake of thinking that the period of slavery was short in Trinidad. The period of plantation slavery was probably short in Trinidad. But those people, the Spanish people, had slaves from the time they came, right? From the time they demolished or devastated the Amerindian population, they brought people to work as domestic servants. So regardless of whether you think of them as domestic servants or plantation workers, they were still slaves. You see, right? But the point we're making is
that point is taken, but you're also making the point to where the people who were slaves in Trinidad and at the time, they were not plantation slaves. So the conditions under which they were subjected to was completely different from the plantation system that obtained in Jamaica.
Yeah, we're just saying that they were treated differently from the way that the plantation slaves were. No, nobody is saying that slavery was nice. Slavery
No, it wasn't.
nice anyway, right? So it was dehumanizing, and it's something that we've talked about at length here over the last year, right? Deplorable, and we're all opposed to it. So
yeah, I find Peter Khan is very quiet tonight, man. I don't understand.
Let me take a smoke with him, man.
I'm just wondering why you had to say that slavery is deplorable and we oppose it.
Okay.
I would think that's a given.
Right. Well, I was just talking to you as you ain't say one shit yet for the night.
Okay, boss.
Them white people again.
Evil.
Okay.
To support the theory that Atai book that you read, remember Jamaica?
No, this was a documentary, and this was a documentary on television.
Well, remember Jamaica produced Usain Bolt. Nobody could touch him, boy. He come from good stuff, right?
It's nice to see you, Atai. What it is.
Well, I'm here for the first time.